A human janitor secretly cared for 2 alien orphans. Then their queen mother came. The Corvin interchange did not care about anyone, and Martin Vale had made his peace with that a long time ago. It was a transfer station, Junction 9 of the Reach line, a fat gray ring of steel and habit turning slowly around a gas giant the color of old bruises. 40,000 people passed through it in any given week, and almost none of them looked at it twice. It existed to move freight from one hull to another, to stamp transit documents, to sell bad coffee to people waiting for connections they resented. Its corridors were the color of dishwater. Its announcements were delivered in a voice that had been recorded by someone who sounded like they were already thinking about something else. The interchange authority ran it the way a tired man runs a bath, with the minimum attention required to avoid disaster, and not 1 degree more. Martin was 54 years old, and he had been cleaning it for 19 of them. Custodial technician, 3rd grade. That was the title on his file, which nobody had opened in a decade. In practice, it meant that between the hours of 400 and 1400 station time, Martin and his cart moved through the lower thirds of the ring, the freight galleries, the subdecks, the maintenance levels where the interchange kept its pipes and its shame and made small broken things work again. He mopped when mopping was called for, but mostly he fixed. A hinge that shrieked. A light panel that strobed at a frequency that gave the dock crews headaches. A water reclamation valve that had been weeping into a wall cavity for 6 years, because 6 years of work orders had been filed, and none of them had been read. A thing that's broken isn't garbage, his father had told him once, in a shipyard that no longer existed, on a world Martin had not seen in 30 years. It's just waiting for somebody patient. Martin was patient. It was, as far as he could tell, his entire inventory of talent. He was not clever in any way the interchange rewarded, not ambitious, not loud. He was a wide, quiet man with gray coming into his beard and hands that had been dragged through 4 decades of honest damage, and he had discovered early in life that a man like him was functionally invisible. People's eyes went over him the way they went over a support column. For years he had thought of it as a small daily insult, being furniture. Then, in the winter of his 19th year on the Corvin interchange, he found the thief in the subdecks, and being furniture became the most useful thing he had ever been. It started with protein packs. The count came up short on a Tuesday. Martin kept a supply cache in his workroom on subdeck 4, a converted storage alcove off the old filtration gallery, where he kept spare parts, his tools, a kettle, and a shelf of authority-issue ration packs against the long shifts when the commissary was closed. Nobody else came down there. Nobody else had come down there in years. The filtration gallery had been decommissioned when the station switched to the new reclamation loop, and now it was 400 meters of cold, dead machinery and colder air, sealed off from the public levels by doors that said authorized personnel in paint that was giving up. 12 packs on the shelf on Monday, 9 on Tuesday. Martin stood in front of the shelf for a long moment with his thermos in his hand. Then he counted again, because he was a careful man, and got 9 again. Rats, another man might have said. But there were no rats on the Corvin interchange. The authority was incompetent, not filthy, and anyway rats did not open the sealed film on a ration pack and take the pack and leave the shelf otherwise undisturbed. The remaining packs squared off neat as soldiers. Rats did not, he found on closer inspection, leave a smudged handprint on the edge of the shelf at the height of his hip. A small handprint, 4 fingers. Human hands had 5. Martin looked at that print for a while. He thought about the forms he was supposed to fill out. There was a form for everything on the interchange, including, he had no doubt, Form C11, report of unauthorized presence, subhabitat levels, which would go into a queue, which would eventually produce a security sweep, which would produce a person in restraints in the processing wing, because that was what the interchange did with people it found in its walls who did not have transit stamps. Processing. a word that told you everything about the machine and nothing about the people fed into it. 4 fingers at the height of his hip. Martin did not fill out a form. Martin made a second pot of tea and put 6 more ration packs on the shelf, and beside them, after some thought, a chemical heat cell, the kind the dock crews cracked and stuffed into their gloves during hull work, and then he took his cart and left the workroom and did not lock the door. The next morning the packs were gone, and the heat cell was gone, and squared off neatly on the empty shelf, in a straight deliberate line, were 3 small bolts, a length of copper wire, and a dead power coupling. The kind of treasure you could pick out of the scrap bins in the freight galleries if you were small and quick and desperate to pay for what you took. Payment, the thief had left payment. Martin sat down on his stool and looked at 3 bolts and a coil of wire, and felt something move in his chest that had not moved in a long time. It took him 4 days to find them, and he found them because he stopped looking. He knew every sound the subdecks made. 19 years of walking them had put the station's noises into him the way the sea gets into a fisherman, the tick of thermal expansion when the ring turned its flank to the star, the size of the pressure system, the specific rattle of every specific grate. So he did not hunt. He simply went about his work in the filtration gallery, slower than usual, fixing a junction box that did not particularly need fixing, and he let his ears do what 19 years had trained them to do. On the 4th day, over the hum of his soldering iron, he heard a cough. Small, muffled, quickly stifled, and then a second sound, softer, that he understood at once and completely, an even smaller person being hushed. The cough had come from the old plenum behind Filtration Bank 6, a dead-air space, 2 meters high, that had once fed the intake manifolds and now fed nothing at all. There was one way in, a maintenance hatch behind the bank, and you would only know the hatch was there if the station's bones were your job. Martin put down the soldering iron. He did not walk to the hatch. He stood in the middle of the gallery, in plain view of the dark seam behind Bank 6, and he spoke at the ordinary volume of a man talking to a coworker, because whispering was what hunters did. "I'm not security," he said. "I'm the janitor. You've seen me. I fix things down here." He let that sit. The gallery hummed. "The food's not a trap. There's no tracker in it. There's no camera in my room. There's more where it came from, and there's a kettle, and it's warm. That's all." Silence of the specific straining kind that is made of held breath. "I'm going to leave a light on," Martin said. "The cold gets worse tonight, rings turning." He went back to his workroom. He left the door open and the small lamp on, and he set the kettle going, and he sat on his stool with his back mostly to the door, mending the frayed strap of his tool bag with waxed thread, and he waited without waiting, the way you wait for a wild thing. An hour, 2. Then in the polished side of the kettle, a shape in the doorway. She was a child, even braced for it, that landed on him like a dropped crate. Alien, yes, skin a soft lavender gray like dusk, dark hair the deep blue of ink going black, hacked short with something dull, large violet eyes flecked with amber, set in a small fierce face, but a child before anything else, 9 years old or its equivalent, wearing the ruin of what had once been very fine clothing under a freight blanket worn as a cloak. Across her cheekbones and the backs of her 4-fingered hands ran faint silver markings, delicate as frost on glass. In the lamplight they glimmered, brightening and dimming with her breathing. She had a length of pipe in one hand. Behind her, gripping the hem of her blanket with both hands and peering around her hip, was a second child, and this one broke Martin's heart on sight and did not give it back. A boy, 4 years old, perhaps less. Same dusk skin, same frost-patterned silver, but on him the markings ran everywhere, chaotic and bright, and his eyes were enormous, and he had wrapped himself in the sleeve of an adult's coat that dragged behind him on the floor like a shed skin. The girl looked at Martin. Martin looked at the kettle and did not turn around. "Tea's hot," he said. "Cups are on the second shelf. The blue one doesn't have a chip in it. That one's the best one." A long silence. Then in accented but startlingly precise standard, cold as a magistrate. "If you tell anyone we are here," the girl said, "I will bite you and we will run and you will never find us." "That's fair," Martin said. Another silence, in which the enormity of an adult saying that's fair to her terms visibly rearranged something behind the girl's eyes. "The little one first," she said at last. "He eats first, then me, that is the rule." "Good rule," said Martin. "Whose?" The frost lines on her face flickered, dimmed. "Someone who is dead," she said, and came in, pipe still in hand, and pulled the boy in behind her, and stood him by the heater, and put herself between the child and the man with the exactness of a soldier taking up a post. Martin poured the tea, and set out 3 ration packs, and slid the blue cup down the bench to where small 4-fingered hands could reach it, and asked no questions at all. That was the first night. There would, in the end, be 61 of them. He learned their names slowly, the way you earn anything worth having. The boys came first. The boy gave it away himself on the 3rd evening, drowsy with warmth and half a ration pack, mumbling it into his sister's shoulder when she carried him to the hatch. "Ruby." The girl caught Martin hearing it and glared a warning that would have stripped paint. Hers took 9 days. 9 days of the same quiet ritual: the open door, the kettle, the food set out, the man on his stool with his back mostly turned, mending things before she said from the doorway, unprompted, in the voice of someone paying a debt, "Annie. My name is Annie. You do not say it where the walls can hear." "The walls down here are mine," Martin said, "but all right, not where the walls can hear." He learned other things without asking. He learned that they had been on the station longer than he had guessed, weeks before the missing protein packs, living out of the plenum, drinking condensation runoff from a pipe Annie had shrewdly picked as the cleanest, eating whatever could be lifted from the freight galleries by a 9-year-old who moved like smoke. He learned that Annie slept in front of her brother, always between him and the hatch, always with the pipe. He learned that Ruby did not talk much and coughed too much, a small wet cough that Martin, who had spent his life around dock crews, did not like at all. He learned that the frost patterns on their skin were called Veth lines. Annie let the word slip once and did not take it back, and that they brightened with feeling. Joy, fear, and cold all lit the children up like windows at dusk, which explained the dead dark plenum, and why they never went near the public levels where any glance could find them glowing. And he learned, from 100 small tells he was too patient to poke at, that they had not always been hungry. It was in how Annie held the chipped station cup, with 2 hands precisely, a court gesture wearing rags. It was in her standard, which was not gutter standard but tutor's standard, drilled and formal. It was in the boy's coat, the adult coat he dragged and slept in, which under its grime was a deep amber wool finer than anything sold on 9 stations, with an embroidered edge that had been picked carefully apart, thread by thread, to remove something that had once been sewn there. A crest, maybe. A name. Someone had taken these children out of a burning life, stripped every mark off them, taught the girl rules: he eats first. No names where walls can hear, trust no uniform, and then, somewhere between that life and Martin's shelf of ration packs, that someone had stopped being alive. He did not ask. She told him anyway, in pieces, over weeks, because 61 nights is a long time, and even soldiers of 9 years old get tired of holding a wall alone. The man's name had been Sorrel. He had been old, Annie said, older than Martin, with a white braid and a scar through his lip, and he had served her family since before her mother was born. On the last night of the life before, she called it that, the life before, and her Veth lines went dark when she said it. There had been lamps breaking, and shouting in the residence, and Sorrel had come through her bedroom wall where no door was, carrying Ruby under one arm, and had taken them down through the roots of the palace to a boat that was not the royal boat, while behind them the sky over the capital caught fire. They burned the sarin, Annie said. One of the last nights this was, her voice very flat, her eyes on the heater's coil. The royal yacht, everyone saw it burn. It went up with all hands past the third moon, and the wreck said we were on it because Sorrel made the wreck say that. He was clever. That was the point that everyone saw. Her 4 fingers tightened on the blue cup. Even her. That was the price, Sorrel said. For it to work on the enemy, it had to work on everyone. Even her. Even who? Martin asked, very quietly. It was the first question he had permitted himself in 60 days. And he looked up at him. And with the air of a girl laying down the last and heaviest stone she carried, she reached into her collar and drew out the thing she wore against her skin on a cord, a disc of dark metal the size of Martin's thumbnail, cracked across its face, dead as the filtration banks, and turned it so the lamplight found the design cut into it. A seat. A stylized seat, or throne, ringed in a wreath of flame. My mother, said Annie, princess of the Ilvan sovereignty, is the queen. Martin Vale sat very still on his stool in his workroom on his subdeck, on his gray and indifferent station, and looked at the crest of the amber seat. Because he knew it, everyone knew it. You could not stand in a commissary queue anywhere on the reach line for the last year without the news feeds putting it in front of you. The Ilvan Succession War. 11 months of it. A coup on the night the feeds had learned to call the Night of Broken Lamps. The Queen's consort dead in the residence. The Queen herself off-world at a fleet review and therefore, by the width of that one accident, alive. The Lord Regent Atran Vihal, cousin to the murdered consort, seizing the capital and the council, and declaring a regency in the name of stability. And the Queen Ravessa Ilkeen, the feeds said her name like a drumbeat, refusing the regency, holding the fleet, and taking her own capital back moon by moon and month by month in a war that had ended formally only that spring. Martin remembered the footage from the war's first week. Everyone did. The royal yacht Sarene burning past the third moon, and the announcement, and the regent's people wearing mourning bands for the heirs while their master consolidated everything the heirs would have inherited. And he remembered a detail the feeds had chewed on for months because it was strange and sad and made good content, that the Queen had never held the funeral rites. 11 months of war, victory, a capital retaken, a regent driven to the border systems with a rump of loyalists and a fortune in stolen accounts, and still no rights for her children. Her own counsel pressed her, the feeds speculated, grief experts were interviewed. The Queen said nothing at all on the subject, ever, and her silence had been the strangest thing on the news for a year. She had never said the words, Martin thought, because saying them makes it true, and she couldn't afford to check whether it was, and she couldn't afford not to hope. He looked at the 2 children in the lamplight of his workroom, the girl watching him take it in, chin up, braced for disbelief, the boy asleep against her side with his fist in the amber coat, and something in Martin's chest turned over with a weight he had not carried since he was young. Sorrel was taking you to her, he said. To the fleet, and he nodded once. There was a man on the second station who was supposed to move us up the line. Sorrel knew him from the old service. But Sorrel was hurt from the first night from the residence. He never said how badly. He kept his coat on. Her voice did not change, and that was the worst part. She reported it the way she reported everything. A soldier's daughter giving a soldier's account. He died in a cargo hold 2 transfers back. He was talking to me about the route, and then he was not talking. I took his coat for Ruvi and his money for the passage, and I could not take him anywhere, so I said the words over him myself. I knew most of them. A pause. The man on the second station was gone when we got there, or he was never real, or Sorrel remembered wrong. He was very sick by then. So I picked the biggest station on the line because Sorrel said crowds are walls and we came here. And then the money was gone, and then we were in your ceiling. How long, Martin said, were you going to live in my ceiling? Until Ruvi was bigger, said Annie, with the terrible practicality of a child who had already redesigned her entire future around a plenum, or until I thought of something. Martin looked at her for a long moment. 9 years old, 60 days in a dead-air space with a 4-year-old and a pipe, and 11 months before that outrunning a usurper's mourning bands, and before that a bedroom wall opening in the middle of the night onto the end of the world. And still, he eats first. Still, payment left on the shelf, 3 bolts and a coil of wire because whatever else got stripped away, her people did not take without giving. Well, Martin said at last and got up and put the kettle back on, because in his experience every unbearable thing in life went down a little easier with tea. You thought of something. You thought of me. The frost lines on Enni's face did something he had not seen them do before. They brightened not the hard flare of fear he knew, but a slow, unwilling warmth, like a lamp being turned up by someone who distrusted light. You were an accident, she informed him with dignity. Most good things are, said Martin. He did not sleep that night, and lying awake in his bunk in the workers' block, staring at the pipes, he took stock of his situation like a man inspecting a hull for stress fractures. The arithmetic was simple and it was ugly. He was a custodial technician, 3rd grade, in possession of the 2 most valuable children in the Reach. Valuable to a mother with a fleet, and valuable in a very different way to a defeated regent whose entire surviving claim to anything rested on those children staying dead. The war was over, but the regent was not. Atran Vihal sat in the border systems with his loyalists and his stolen fortune, and Martin did not need a political education to work out what a man like that would pay to make sure a burned yacht stayed burned. Which meant the children's protection was, precisely, the lie. As long as the whole galaxy believed the heirs died on the Saren, nobody was looking. The moment anyone looked, 1 manifest audit, 1 security sweep, 1 board officer wondering why the janitor drew double rations. The same lie flipped over and became the trap, because dead children who turn up alive have exactly one thing certain in their future: someone coming to correct the error. So the answer that solved everything, the obvious answer, walk into the Ilving consulate on ring level 2 and say the Queen's children are in my ceiling, was also the stupidest possible move, and Martin knew it the way he knew load-bearing from decorative. A consulate was a building full of clerks. Clerks filed things. Filed things were read, and not only by the people they were addressed to. Every station on the Reach leaked, and the Corvin interchange leaked worst of all, because the authority paid its people just badly enough to make every database on the ring a rentable asset. He had mopped those consulate corridors on the overnight rotation for 6 years. He knew exactly how many locked doors stood between a visitor's statement and the Queen, and how many underpaid hands touched it on the way. No, the children had survived a year on one principle. Everyone believes it, even her, and Martin was not going to be the patient, kindly fool who broke the principle before he could deliver the proof. What he could do in the meantime was what he did. He could keep them. And so began the strangest, and he would admit much later, the finest season of Martin Vale's gray and invisible life. He rebuilt his routine around a secret the size of a kingdom, and disguised it as no routine at all. He requisitioned nothing unusual, no flags in the system. Instead, he bought with his own wages, in cash, in small amounts, in the crowded commissaries of 3 different shift changes, where a wide, quiet man in coveralls registered on no one at all. Food, and then better food. When he learned that Ilving children needed more copper in their diet than human rations carried, and worked out from a freight manifest which cargo lines stocked the right supplement. Warm underlayers, bought in the smallest adult size and altered at night with the same wax thread that mended his tool bag. He had never sewn a child's cuff before, and he was slow at it, and Annie watched his big scarred hands do it and said nothing, but her veth lines glowed the whole time. Soap, a comb, a packet of colored marker sticks, an impulse purchase that embarrassed him at the register, which turned out to be the single greatest treasure ever to enter the plenum. Within a week, the dead air space behind Filtration Bank 6 had a mural running the length of it, a burning boat, a white braid, towers under 2 moons, and a huge lumpy figure holding a kettle, which Ruvi identified, patting it as Marn. The cough was the hard part. Ruvi's cough was not getting better, and Martin knew why. The plenum's air was dead and cold, and the boy's people were built for warmth. A human child would have been in a clinic weeks ago. A clinic meant records. So Martin did what the subdecks had taught him. He treated the system, not the symptom. Over 4 nights, with parts drawn one at a time from 4 different supply points so that no single requisition looked like anything, he quietly retasked a decommissioned circulation fan, spliced it to a heating element officially listed as scrapped, and gave the plenum behind Bank 6 its own small ventilation loop, warm filtered air whispering through a dead space that appeared on every station schematic as sealed. It was, he was fairly sure, the single largest theft of authority resources in his career. Perhaps 4 credits a day in power, invisible in the subdeck baseline. The first night the warm air came on, Ruvi lay down on the floor directly on top of the vent with his arms and legs spread like a starfish and refused to move for an hour, glowing from head to foot. And then he laughed, the first time Martin ever heard it, an astonished, rusty, hiccuping sound, a laugh that had not been used in a year, and Martin turned away and cleaned a spotless wrench for a while, because his eyes were doing something unbecoming a custodial technician, 3rd grade. Within a fortnight the cough was fading. Within 3, Ruvi talked. Not much, and half of it in Ilvain, but he was 4 and Martin was patient, and the boy would sit on the workbench with his boots drumming the cabinet while Martin fixed things, handing him tools, usually the wrong tool, presented with enormous confidence, and narrating an unbroken stream of commentary of which Martin understood 1 word in 5 and treasured all of them. Annie pretended to find this childish. She sat through every session anyway, doing the exercises Martin set her from a battered maintenance manual, because a princess in a ceiling still needed schooling, and mathematics was the same in every language. She was ferociously quick, and corrected 2 errors in the manual's load tables inside a month, and Martin told her so, and she shrugged with elaborate indifference while her frost lines shone like a festival. They were his hour of color in a gray life. He would have been ashamed to say it out loud and never once needed to. The children knew. Ruvi took to standing at the plenum hatch at the end of each evening for a solemn exchange of nods, man to man. And Annie said it only once sideways in the dead voice she used for the things that mattered most, watching him pack up his cart on some ordinary night. Sorrow would have liked you, she said. He was also not clever. He was also the other thing. What other thing? She hunted through her formal, tutored standard for the word and found it. Sufficient, said Annie. Martin thought about that word for days. He was still thinking about it when the pale man came to the Corvin interchange, and everything patient and quiet came to an end. Martin noticed him, the way you notice a wrong sound in a familiar machine. It was on a Thursday in the freight galleries, and the man was standing at the junction of Gallery 6 with a data slate, and he was doing nothing wrong at all, which was the wrongness. Passengers didn't come to the freight levels. Officials came with escorts and clipboards and self-importance. This man had none of it, mid-40s in appearance, pale in the way of someone who chose it, dressed in the gray, good, forgettable clothing of a mid-tier logistics auditor, standing at a junction with the stillness of a man who is not waiting for anything because he is already doing the thing he came to do, which was looking, not at cargo, at the walls, at the grates, at the seams of the station low, at the height where small things move. Martin swept the length of Gallery 6, slowly, invisibly, furniture with a broom, and passed within 3 meters of him. The man's eyes went over Martin exactly the way everyone's eyes went over Martin, and for the first time in his life, Martin was glad of it in a way that had teeth. That evening he asked one question in the dock crew's canteen, casually into the general noise the way you tune a rumor. Anyone know the audit fellow poking round 6? And the answers came back the way station answers do, in shrugs and fragments that assembled themselves into a shape. Name of Corin. Came in on the liner Tuesday. Some kind of recovery contractor, insurance, salvage, asset retrieval. The paperwork said one thing and the manner said another. He'd been down at the transit office buying passenger manifest history, which was illegal, which meant it cost extra. And he'd been asking politely, offhandedly, with money in the questions about stowaways. Not stowaways in general. Whether anyone had ever heard of any stowaways found on the ring in, say, the last half a year. Anything odd in the low levels. Kids, even. You hear stories, the man had apparently said, smiling, buying a round he didn't drink from. Kids get everywhere. Martin stood in the canteen queue with his tray and his heart going like a hammer on cold steel, and made himself eat a full dinner at his usual speed, because the day a routine man breaks routine is the day he becomes visible. But he knew. The lie had held for a year, and now, somewhere in the wide galaxy, it had sprung a leak, a docking record, a face on a feed, a cargo hold death 2 transfers back that someone had finally connected to a route, and the correction had arrived on the Tuesday liner wearing good gray clothes. The hunt had come to Junction 9, and it was standing in his galleries, reading the seams of his walls, looking for the height where small things move. He told Annie that night, straight and plain, because she had earned plain 100 times over. He watched the frost lines on her face go dark, watched her hand find the pipe she had never stopped keeping by the hatch, watched her do the arithmetic he had done in the canteen queue, and watched her arrive, in about 8 seconds, at the same sum. "We have to call her," Annie said. "Now, before he finds us. It stops being a secret either way. It should stop being a secret to her first." "Yes," Martin said. "The question is how. Anything that goes through the station goes through the station. He's already buying records. If I walk into that consulate, he'll know by supper." Annie's hand went to her collar. She drew out the cracked disc on its cord and held it flat on her palm, and for the first time she told him what it actually was. "It's not a pendant," she said. "It's a signet beacon. Every member of the blood carries one from their naming day. It has our." She hunted for the standard, our proof in it. Blood proof. A code that says this is truly Annie Ilkeen, not a trick, not an actor, not the Regent's fake. Not be copied. If it sends and her fleet hears it, they know it is me, not maybe me. Her fingers closed around it. Sorrel tried to use it the first week. It was already broken. It broke in the wall the night we ran. It took a hit that was, a pause, dead voice. It was on a cord around my neck, and Sorrel carried me through the wall against his chest, and something hit him in the back hard enough to crack it. He kept walking. I told you he never took his coat off. Another pause. The sending part is dead, and the power part is dead. But the proof part is sealed deeper. Sorrel said the proof part was probably alive. He was going to find someone to rebuild the rest around it. He said it would take a real technician. She looked up, and her chin came up with the exact bearing of a Queen Martin had only ever seen on news feeds. "You fix things nobody thinks can be fixed. I have watched you do it for 60 days. Fix this." Martin took the little disc and turned it under his lamp with a jeweler's care. Cracked casing, a transmitter coil gone to powder, a power cell so dead it was archaeology, and beneath all of it, sunk in a sealed lozenge of resin the size of a grain of rice, something intricate and intact, waiting. A thing that's broken isn't garbage. He breathed out slowly. "The proof part I don't touch," he said. "The rest of it, power, transmitter, antenna, that's parts and patience. I can rebuild it, not pretty. But live." He set the disc down gently on a clean cloth, the way he'd set down something holy, which he had a growing suspicion he had. "Sending's the real problem. This thing was built to whisper to a royal fleet across a room, not shout across the reach. If I boost it and just transmit from the ring, every listening post between here and the border hears a royal blood code screaming from Junction 9, including the ones the Regent pays. We'd bring the Queen and the knife's closer." "Then don't shout from here," Annie said. "Make something else carry it." Martin sat back on his stool. And slowly, in the workroom where he had rebuilt hinges and heaters and other people's mistakes for 19 years, the janitor's knowledge of the station's guts assembled itself into a plan of genuine, quiet criminality. Every liner that left the Corvin interchange performed a departure handshake, a burst exchange with the station's traffic control, compressed and encrypted, logged and forgotten, transmitted again at every station down the line as part of the vessel's rolling record. The handshake system was old, patched, and maintained. This was the beautiful part, from a junction cabinet on Subdeck 2, because the authority had never once in Martin's tenure spent money moving anything that still technically worked. Martin had the cabinet key. Martin had had the cabinet key for 11 years, because Martin was the man who fixed the handshake system when it hiccuped, which it did every winter, and no one else on the station knew or cared where the cabinet was. A tight burst blood code, folded inside a routine departure handshake, riding out of the system inside a liner's own paperwork. Not a scream. A sealed letter in the station's ordinary mail. It would replicate down the line station by station, harmless, invisible, until it brushed against any Ilvan naval receiver anywhere, and the proof woke up and announced itself to exactly the people built to hear it. The Meridian Dawn leaves for the inner reach in 6 days, Martin said. She's the right route. She'll pass 2 systems with Ilvan picket stations. 6 days to rebuild this, and I'll splice it into her handshake the night before departure. He looked at the 2 children in the lamplight, Ruby asleep on the warm vent, starfish fashion, one hand in the amber coat, Annie upright and burning-eyed, 60 days of wall-holding balanced now on a cracked disc and a janitor's soldering iron. 6 days of being boring, Martin said. All of us. Nothing changes, I mop. You stay dark. The pale man finds nothing because there's nothing where he's looking. And if he finds it anyway, then he deals with me, said Martin. And there was something in the flat way the big quiet man said it that made any, who had faced down the end of the world, decide not to ask the follow-up question. The rebuild took 5 nights, and they were the most exacting 5 nights of his working life. He drew the parts the way he'd drawn the heaters. 1 component, 1 supply point, 1 plausible reason, never a pattern. A microcell from a decommissioned emergency lamp. A transmitter coil, hand wound, 300 turns of the copper wire a small thief had once left on his shelf as payment. A symmetry that made him smile every time he touched it. A casing machined at 300 from a brass valve fitting, because the resin lozenge deserved better than a printed shell. Annie assisted. She had the small, steady hands the work wanted, and she would not be kept from it. It was her name in the resin, she said, so it would be her hands on the coil. And Martin, who knew a load-bearing principle when he heard one, moved the second stool to the bench for good. They worked in the lamplight with tea going cold, the janitor and the princess, and on the 5th night at a few minutes past 2, the little brass disc on the bench woke, ran its self-check, and lit a single point of amber light, steady as a held breath. Annie did not cheer. She put her 4-fingered hand flat over the light, as if feeling for a heartbeat, and her frost lines rose slowly to the brightest Martin had ever seen them, and she said something in Ilvan, very quietly, that had the cadence of the words you say over the dead. And then she looked up and translated, unasked, which she had never once done before. It means, the lamp is not broken, she said. It is from a story. The Regent's people called their night the Night of Broken Lamps, but that is not its real name. The real story says a lamp is not broken while one keeper lives to carry it. She took her hand off the little amber light and looked at him and made the formal introduction 65 nights late. Martin Vale, keeper. My mother will want to know what to call you. Tell her the janitor did it, Martin said, gruff, and turned to clean the bench, and Annie let him pretend, because by then they understood each other completely. He made the splice the following night, the night before the Meridian Dawn sailed, and it was the calmest crime ever committed on the Corvin interchange. A wide, quiet man in coveralls opening a junction cabinet he'd opened 100 times, on his own rotation, on his own deck, logging a routine seasonal check that was in fact genuinely due, patience again. He had waited for the calendar to make his lie true, and folding 40 grams of brass and proof into the outbound handshake queue with hands that did not hurry. 12 minutes. He closed the cabinet, signed the log, and mopped the corridor on his way out, because the corridor needed mopping. At 9:40 the next morning, from the end of Gallery 6, pushing his cart, Martin watched the Meridian Dawn drop her clamps and slide off the ring, huge and indifferent, carrying 1,100 passengers, 6,000 tons of freight and one sealed letter to a queen. He watched her until she was a line of light, and then a point, and then nothing, and then he went back to work, because the day a routine man breaks routine is the day he becomes visible. He was mopping when the pale man found the plenum's warm air. Martin heard about it before he saw it, the way he heard everything, a fragment in the canteen, the audit fellow down on subdeck for this morning, poking at the old filtration bank with a thermal wand. And the floor dropped out of Martin's world with no sound at all, because a thermal wand was the one hunter's tool he could not clean up after. Every schematic said Bank 6 was dead and sealed. Every schematic was right, to the eye, to the hand, to the records. But warm, filtered air does not care about schematics. It holds its little envelope of kindness around a hidden hatch, degree by traitorous degree, and a man who reads the seams of walls for a living, at the height where small things move, had walked the dead gallery with an instrument that saw heat, and found, in 400 meters of cold, one warm seam. Corin had not opened it. That was the professional's tell, and it was worse than if he had. He had found the hatch, read its warmth, and walked away to make arrangements, because a retrieval contractor does not retrieve with his own hands on a station where he has no authority. He had gone upring to the authority offices, and Martin's canteen fragments tracked him there through the afternoon like a fire spreading floor by floor. Corin at the transit office, Corin at the security desk. Corin, and here the fragment came from a clerk who owed Martin for 6 years of fixed chairs and asked nothing, presenting documentation naming him an insurance investigator with a warrant request for a contamination inspection of the decommissioned filtration system. Subdeck 4, priority processing, fees paid. Processing. The machine's favorite word. The warrant would grind through the authorities' queue overnight and come out the other side by mid-morning as a legal instrument, and Corin would walk into the gallery behind 2 board security officers with every stamp in order, and open the hatch, and the machine would hand him the children with a receipt. Martin stood in his workroom with a cold kettle and did the last arithmetic of his invisible life. The letter was away, 1 day gone, 4 days minimum before it could brush an Ilving picket, days more before anything with a fleet behind it could reach Junction 9. Corin had a warrant coming with the morning. The gap between the two was the whole problem, and the gap was where Martin lived. The hunter had found a warm seam in a dead wall. So the wall would be dead by morning. And the small things that moved would move one last time, to the one place on the Corvin interchange that no warrant, no wand, and no clever pale man reading seams would ever think to point an instrument at. "Any," Martin said into the plenum hatch, at 22:10 station time, in the ordinary voice of a man talking to a coworker. "Pack the mural markers. We're moving house." The move took 4 hours, and Martin spent them the way he had spent 19 years, patiently, invisibly, and in exactly the places his duty roster said he should be. His overnight rotation, by a mercy of scheduling he had privately verified 3 times, covered the ring's core service ways, and the core service ways led everywhere, including to the place he had chosen, a place so absurd, so hidden in plain sight, that when he told Annie she stared at him for a full 3 seconds and then made the rusty hiccuping sound for only the 2nd time in his life. The authority sanitation depot, his own depot. Specifically, the depot's equipment loft, a mezzanine of shelving above the cart bays where the authority stored drums of floor compound and crates of replacement mop heads in quantities that would outlast the station itself, inventoried by no one, visited by no one, climate-controlled to protect the compound, and situated 40 meters from a security desk. Nobody hunts the hunter's tool shed. Corin was reading the station for hidden warmth in dead spaces. He would never in his professional life point a wand at the janitor's supply loft, warm by design, mundane by definition, with authorized foot traffic all day. Crowds are walls, Sorrel had taught the girl. So were mop heads. They went through the service ways in coveralls. He had bought the smallest adult size weeks ago for warmth and altered them at night. And now the alterations turned out to be armor. Two small figures in authority gray with authority caps, walking behind a janitor and his cart through corridors with no cameras, because Martin had spent 19 years learning exactly which corridors had no cameras, on a route he had walked so many thousand times his feet did the thinking. Ruby rode the last stretch inside the cart itself, in the fresh linen bin, delighted beyond all containment, glowing through the canvas like a lantern until Annie leaned down and hissed the hush word, and the light obediently went out. By 300 the loft was a home. Bedrolls behind the compound drums, the heater's little cousin Martin had built too. Patience again, breathing warmth along the shelf line, the amber coat folded into a pillow, the mural markers stowed, the brass beacon's twin point of light hidden against a small chest, and a pipe still within reach of a small four-fingered hand. Then Martin went back down to subdeck 4, alone, and killed his own kindness. He unspliced the heater loop, restored the scrapped listings, drew the warm envelope out of the plenum degree by degree with the patience of a man rebuilding his lie in reverse, and swept the dead air space until it held nothing but cold and a faint ghost of marker ink on one wall, which he looked at for a moment and left. Let the wand read that. The inspection came at 10:15, and Martin was mopping Gallery 6 when it passed him Corin in his good gray clothes, a warrant slate, 2 security officers wearing the boredom of men lent to someone else's errand. Corin's eyes went over the janitor the way everyone's eyes went over the janitor. They were inside for 50 minutes. Martin mopped 400 meters of clean floor with a heart going like a dropped hammer and a face like a support column, and when they came out, he read the whole result in the officer's walk looser, faster, an errand dissolved, and in Corin's stillness, which had stopped being the stillness of a man doing the thing he came to do, and become the stillness of a man recalculating in public. The seam had been warm and the space beyond it was cold and empty, and had always been cold and empty. The schematics agreed. The thermal record now agreed. The warrant had opened a dead wall and found the station's word confirmed. Whatever leak had brought the hunt to Junction 9 now ended, evidentially, in 400 meters of nothing. Corin stopped. In the middle of Gallery 6, 10 meters from Martin's mop, the pale man stood and turned, one slow full circle, reading the seams of the freight gallery one last time, and for a single second on the way past, his eyes met Martin's and did not go over him. They stopped. A man who hunted by noticing at last the one fixed feature of every corridor he'd walked for 9 days. And Martin looked back with the mild, incurious, bovine patience of 19 years of being furniture, leaned on his mop, and nodded the small nod that station workers give officials. And after 2 long seconds Corin's eyes moved on, because there was nothing there, because there had never been anything there, because no one on the Corvin interchange was less interesting than the man who cleaned it. Corin left on the evening liner. Martin watched the departure listing update from a maintenance terminal and did not trust it, and was right not to. A man like that sold his findings up a chain, and chains could send other men. But the hunt had lost the scent at a cold hatch, and the letter was 3 days gone down the reach, and in the loft above the cart bays 2 children slept warm behind a wall of mop heads, and there was nothing left in all the world for a patient man to do but his rounds. 4 more days he did them. On the 5th day, at 6:42 station time, 3 Ilvan warships came out of the dark off Junction 9 and filled every screen on the ring. Martin heard it before he saw it, the station's voice, the recorded announcement voice that always sounded like it was thinking of something else, suddenly replaced by a live human being audibly reading words with their hands shaking. All traffic hold, all departures suspended, by direction of the interchange authority in cooperation with a pause, a swallow, the sovereign fleet of the Ilvan sovereignty. He came up the service stairs into the main concourse and saw them through the viewport band. Not liners, not patrol boats, but capital ships, amber-hulled and vast, standing off the ring in a formal blade of three, and every soul on the concourse silent under them. The Corvan interchange, which did not care about anyone, had discovered in the span of one announcement exactly how much someone could care about it. She did not send an envoy. That was the detail the feeds would replay for a year afterward, the detail that told the whole Reach what kind of queen the war had made. The shuttle that crossed from the flagship carried the queen herself. No herald, no advanced protocol team for the authority to entangle in processing, just a boarding party in amber and black moving through the arrival hall at a pace that turned Administrator Pell's welcoming committee into a jog. And at the front of it, unhelmeted Ravessa Ilkeen, holder of the amber seat, in fleet dress with no crown at all, carrying in one hand a small brass disc that was still, faithfully, transmitting. The beacon had a finder function. Martin had rebuilt it without fully understanding that layer of the sealed proof, and it had been leading her by the hand since her shuttle cleared the flagship. Down through the ring, down past the concourse where 40,000 transients pressed against the barriers to watch a queen walk, down the freight elevators her guards commandeered with a single look, down into the gray lower thirds where no one important had ever gone, to a sanitation depot, and a shelving loft, and a wall of mop heads with warm light leaking through the gaps. Martin was there. He had been there since 6:50, since the first announcement, standing at the foot of the loft ladder with his cart parked like a barricade, and no plan at all beyond being between the children and whatever came through the depot door, because some posts you take up without deciding to. He heard the guards before he saw them, heard Pell's voice performing importance somewhere back in the corridor and being ignored, and then the depot door opened, and the queen of the Ilvan sovereignty walked into the smell of floor compound with a brass disc in her hand, and stopped. She was tall, and she was her daughter, said 50 times. The same dusk lavender skin, the same violet eyes flecked amber, the same frost lines, hers running from temple to jaw in patterns of rank, and the same terrible upright bearing of someone who had held a wall alone for a very long time. 11 months of war and a year of unspoken funeral rites were carved into her face, and her eyes went past Martin as if he were furniture. He was glad of it. One last time to the loft, to the light through the mop heads, to the small sounds up there of 2 children who had been told to stay dark and were failing, because they knew the finder function too, because they had felt it wake, because. "Mama," said Ruvy's voice, very small from behind the wall of mop heads. Martin stepped aside from the ladder. It was the only thing left in his job description. He would carry what happened next for the rest of his life, and never once describe it well, because there are things patience teaches you to fix and things you can only witness. And he came down the ladder first, of course first. He eats first, but she goes first into danger. That was the whole rule of her, and stopped on the bottom rung, and the queen made a sound that no feed ever captured and no throne room ever heard, and then the last 3 meters ceased to exist. She was on her knees on a depot floor in fleet dress with both her children inside her arms, and the 3 of them blazed Veth lines flooding bright from mother to daughter to son and back, one light running through 3 bodies, as if a single lamp had been taken apart a year ago and was only now, finally, reassembled. And the queen wept without any dignity at all, and had never in her reign looked more like a queen. It went on a long time. Her guards turned their backs to the room and made a wall of amber and black, and Martin stood inside it with his cart, because nobody had told him where else to be. It was Annie who remembered him. Annie, still inside her mother's arm, turned in the tangle and found him by the ladder and said, in her clear tutor's standard, words she had plainly been drafting in the loft for 5 days. "Mama, this is Keeper Martin Vale. He found us when we were stealing from him, and he fed us and did not tell anyone for 65 days. He made warm air for Ruvy's cough with his own hands and his own money. He rebuilt the signet when everyone said when it was broken. He sent it inside a ship's papers so the regent's ears would not hear. And when the hunter came with a warrant, he moved us inside his own cart and gave the hunter an empty room and stood at that ladder all morning. She took a breath. He is the reason your children are alive, and he will now say it was nothing, because that is his one flaw. The queen of the Ilvan sovereignty rose from the depot floor with a child on each side of her, and actually looked, at the janitor. "Is she correct?" the queen said. Her voice was wrecked, and it did not matter. It was a voice that had taken back a capital. "Is that your one flaw, Keeper Vale?" "They were hungry," Martin said. "I had food. Anything after that just followed." 65 days followed, said the queen. She crossed the floor to him, her guards flowed, and she stilled them with 2 fingers, and she studied him the way any had studied him the first night, down to the bone, and whatever she was looking for, the finding of it moved visibly through her frost lines. "I am told your station has a word it is fond of, processing." Her mouth did something controlled and dangerous. "My children fell into the gap between every system built to catch them, every records office, every consulate, every ally, every law. What caught them instead was a man with a kettle, who asked no questions and filed no forms. The sovereignty owes you a debt it cannot weigh, and I have learned in this last year exactly what my sovereignty's formal instruments are worth against one sufficient person." She held out her hand, and in it the brass casing he had machined at 300 from a valve fitting shone next to the resin proof of a royal line. "Name what you want, Keeper. It is yours before you finish the sentence." And Martin Vale, custodial technician, 3rd grade, looked at the queen and the ships in the viewport and the 2 children watching him with lamps in their skin, and found the truth by reaching for it the way he reached for tools. "I want to know who's going to look after them," he said. "That's all. Wherever they land, palaces have ceilings too. I'd want to know somebody patient is checking them." There was a silence. In his face performed an "I told you so" of royal magnitude. "Then check them yourself," said the queen. They gave him a title, in the end Keeper of the Heirs, an office of the household that the archivists established had last been filled 200 years prior, whose formal duties were the safety, schooling, and daily welfare of the royal children, and whose actual duties, as Martin practiced them, included a workroom off the residence wing with a kettle in it, a bench with a 2nd and 3rd stool, and an open door. The court did not know what to make of him for about a season, a gray-bearded human in plain clothes with ruined hands, who fixed the residence's sticking doors himself, who the heirs obeyed faster than they obeyed protocol, who the queen consulted with no intermediary. And then the story got out, all of it, the shelf and the plenum and the empty room and the cart, and the sovereignty made up its mind about humanity in roughly the time it takes a rumor to cross a palace. The Night of Broken Lamps got its old name back in the retelling. A lamp is not broken while one keeper lives to carry it. On the first evening in the residence, Ruvi drew the mural again on real paper, the boat, the braid, the towers, the lumpy figure with the kettle, and the queen had it framed, and hung it, over the objection of no one who valued their standing, in the amber gallery among the portraits of the line. And on most evenings, when the day's grand machinery of the sovereignty wound down, a workroom off the residence wing showed a warm light under its door, a princess at the bench correcting the load tables in a new manual, a small prince narrating with enormous confidence and handing over the wrong tool, and a wide, quiet, patient man visible at last, and only to the people who mattered fixing some small broken thing, and letting it take exactly as long as it took.